A human body doesn't break easily, not when the mind still believes. And William Wallace believed, long after he should have begged, long after kings, armies, and betrayal closed in. This is not a sanitized tale of a freedom fighter. It's a descent, a reckoning. And if you think you know how it ends, you don't. Subscribe, because what follows is not for textbooks. This is for those who want the truth, unfiltered. William Wallace did not begin as a legend. He began as a problem. To the English crown, he was less a man and more an infection. He had no noble title, no official command, no seat at court. He had dirt under his nails, rage in his chest, and a gift for turning peasants into an army. That made him dangerous, not because he could win wars, but because he made people believe that wars were winnable. In 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace didn't just defeat a better armed English force, he humiliated them, on their own terms, in their own language, tactics, terrain, and nerve, all bent to his will. That one battle flipped a switch across Scotland, and while nobles hesitated, Wallace acted. He was knighted, declared guardian of the realm. For a brief, impossible moment, a landless fighter became the face of a nation. That moment did not last. Edward I, known even in his own lifetime as the Hammer of the Scots, returned with vengeance. Not with messages, but with armies. Castles fell, alliances collapsed, and Wallace, outnumbered and cornered, was forced into retreat. The nobles broke. Many chose submission, but Wallace refused. He vanished into the hills, became smoke, rumor, whisper. For the English, that was worse than rebellion. That was narrative control slipping, because Wallace wasn't a knight in shining armor. He was a ghost with a sword and a cause. And worse, he was still free. Until 1305. It didn't happen in battle. It didn't happen with honor. It happened in a back room, with ink, betrayal, and a sealed deal. John de Menteith, a Scottish noble who had aligned himself with Edward, gave Wallace up. No conflict, no resistance. Wallace was taken like cargo. The chain didn't clink like justice. It clicked like a lock. But death didn't come swiftly. The English didn't want death. They wanted performance. Wallace was shackled, hands, feet, neck, not for security, for optics, for degradation. He was paraded south from Scotland to London like an exhibit. Along the way, English townsfolk were encouraged to mock, to spit, to jeer. This wasn't transport. It was erosion, days of exposure, no food, no rest, no dignity. By the time he reached London, Wallace wasn't a prisoner. He was a prop. Westminster Hall, August 23rd. The trial was not a trial. There was no defense, no evidence presented on his behalf. He was accused of treason against Edward I, of murder, of barbarism, of unknightly conduct. And that last charge said everything. Wallace was not being judged for fighting. He was being judged for fighting differently, for being unpredictable, wild, disobedient to the rules of war written by the Empire. His response to the charge of treason was short. "I could not be a traitor, for I was never Edward's subject." That sentence cut deeper than any blade. It was a rejection not just of rule, but of legitimacy. Wallace didn't just fight the king, he denied that the king had any claim over him at all. And for that, he would not simply die, he would be erased. The sentence was read out like a script, because it was. Hang him until almost dead, castrate him, burn his genitals, disembowel him while conscious, rip out the heart, behead, quarter the body, send the pieces to corners of the kingdom. Each act had purpose. Each was messaging. This was not medieval chaos. This was imperial design. Because Edward didn't want to kill a man. He wanted to destroy a myth. And he understood something modern power still clings to. A body can be killed. But an idea has to be dismembered. Wallace was no longer the guardian of Scotland. He was a warning sign, a mirror held up to anyone tempted to resist. And the English crown wanted that mirror shattered so completely that even the fragments wouldn't reflect. They thought they were staging a finale. They didn't know they were opening the first act of something much bigger. William Wallace was not brought to the gallows. He was dragged, not metaphorically, physically. On August 23, 1305, he was tied by the ankles and wrists to a horse and pulled through the filth-clogged streets of London. Not on horseback. Behind it. Through refuse, through human waste, through every layer of humiliation the city could offer. The sentence had been clear. He was to be drawn, not transported, not marched, drawn. Because every jolt over cobblestones, every bump, every sharp crack of wheel against stone was another way to strip away the idea of him. Wallace was no longer the guardian of Scotland. He was cargo, flesh, a moving target for public scorn, and the public responded. Thousands lined the route, children, bakers, priests, foreign dignitaries. Wallace passed beneath open windows, beside market stalls, through the stink of city life that now covered him. Some shouted, some spat. Most simply watched, eyes narrowed as if they were unsure whether they were witnessing history or spectacle. For the English elite, it was both. For Wallace, it was the beginning of erasure. The horse moved slowly, intentionally. There was no rush. The body had to arrive broken but breathing. That was part of the sentence, alive enough to feel, conscious enough to understand. Every scrape of stone against skin, every lash of mud and blood across his face was engineered. Wallace was being taught that pain was no longer a moment. It was a condition, a state of being. By the time they reached Smithfield, the open execution ground near the livestock market, Wallace was battered, filthy, half strangled from the drag, but still alive. That, to his captors, was success. A dead man couldn't witness what was about to be done. Smithfield was packed, not just with the poor, but with officials, scribes, men in robes with lists of names and royal decrees. The execution site wasn't just a scaffold. It was a theater. No curtain, no stage, just a platform and a man about to be used like parchment. First came the rope. In medieval England, hanging wasn't efficient. It wasn't clean. It wasn't meant to be. There were no calculations, no drop heights. Wallace was hoisted manually, slowly, so that his feet dangled just inches above the dirt. The rope pulled at his throat, the pressure rising, blood retreating from his face. He kicked, not out of fear, out of instinct. The body clings. He turned dark, tongue out, eyes bulging, but they didn't wait for death. They cut him down just before unconsciousness took hold. His body crashed to the platform, gagging, twitching, gasping, alive, exactly as planned. That was step one, the simulation of death. Step two was mutilation. Before he could even orient himself, before he could breathe again, Wallace was held down, stripped. A knife appeared, not a sword, not an axe, a small hooked blade, personal, surgical. The hangman took his time. No words, no verdicts, just an incision and the severing of William Wallace's genitals. They were held aloft, shown to the crowd, then burned in a fire built specifically for the occasion. Not as punishment, as punctuation. The crown wasn't just killing a man. It was killing legacy, virility, the idea of future rebellion being born from his line. But the body lived, the body screamed, the body knew. And so they continued. The blade went lower, the abdomen opened. Inch by inch, Wallace's intestines were pulled from him, slowly, methodically, as if the executioner was untangling rope. Some say Wallace remained conscious the entire time. his body convulsed, his eyes darting, his breath ragged. He watched, he felt, and still he lived. Because that was the point. This wasn't about execution, it was about message delivery. The crowd wasn't there to witness justice. They were there to be instructed. This is what defiance becomes. This is what happens to legends when they meet the crown. The fire burned bright. Wallace's viscera fed the flames. The smell of scorched flesh mingled with London air. His heart still beat, his lungs still worked, and the crowd still stared, spellbound by the theater of pain. Somewhere in the back, a clerk likely dipped a quill, recording each step, for posterity, for policy, for empire. Because this was not madness, this was governance, and William Wallace, flayed and opened to the sky, was its unwilling headline. There are ways to kill a man that require no weapon, only time, fear, and precision. But William Wallace had endured all that already. What came next was not simply murder, it was the curated destruction of a human body, arranged piece by piece like a message, each act carved in blood. He lay on the scaffold at Smithfield, no longer a man in the eyes of his executioners, but a vessel, something to be emptied. The hanging had nearly ended him. The castration had broken flesh, and now came the act designed to break everything else. The knife entered again, this time deeper, slower. The executioner sliced open Wallace's abdomen, not as a butcher might with haste, but with care. Deliberate, his intestines, long, warm, still alive, were drawn out inch by inch and displayed to the crowd. No one turned away. They had not come for justice, they had come for proof. Proof that resistance was not just punished, but unraveled. The organs were thrown into the fire before Wallace's eyes. The flames hissed, the smoke rose. The symbolism was almost unbearable. Life turned inside out, devoured in front of its owner. And Wallace? He saw, he felt. Chroniclers wrote that he remained conscious, that his eyes tracked the movements, that his body shook not from death throes, but from awareness. He had become a canvas for empire's warnings, not a symbol anymore, but a threat, neutralized live. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The silence was worse. It was agreement. Next came the heart, a final incision. The chest split open. The hangman reached in with blood-slick hands and pulled out the muscle that had once thundered in battle. Wallace's heart, the seat of every defiance, every shout of freedom, was held high, then fed to fire, the last of him. But he was already gone. The brain might have slipped into unconsciousness. The soul, if you believe in that, may have fled earlier. But the English didn't care. The point was not whether Wallace felt the knife. The point was that everyone else did, because when the executioner raised that heart, he wasn't just holding a piece of anatomy, he was holding a warning. And when he let it fall into flame, he wasn't ending a man. He was branding a memory. And still, it wasn't done. Wallace's head was removed cleanly, or as cleanly as a medieval axe could manage. His face, smeared with blood, swollen from rope and impact, was no longer recognizable. But that didn't matter. The head was not for burial. It was for display, dipped in tar, mounted on a pike, placed atop the southern gatehouse of London Bridge. Travelers would see it first, before anything else. The first face to greet you in the capital was the face of defeat. That was the message. But this was still not the end. Because Wallace was sentenced not to die, but to be dismembered. So the body was hacked apart, quartered with brutal tools. Limbs, torso, all separated. Each part packed, transported, nailed up in separate cities. Stirling, Perth, Berwick, Newcastle. Strategic sites, places where Wallace had fought, places that mattered. Now redefined not by victory, but by decay. This was anatomy as policy, flesh as politics. The English weren't burying a man, they were embedding fear across a map. Children would see a leg hanging in a square. Priests would walk under arms nailed to gateposts. Merchants would pass rib cages and know their names were not meant to echo. They would know, this is what resistance becomes. And still, the idea did not die. Because no amount of fire, blood, or tar could cauterize memory. In the villages he left behind, in the hills he once hid in, Wallace's story twisted, not into fact, into something stronger, into myth. It should have ended with silence, with the last breath, with the last cut. But for William Wallace, the most calculated part of his death began only after he died, because the execution wasn't just meant to remove him from the world. It was meant to erase the possibility of his return, not in flesh, but in thought, in story, in defiance. And so his body was not buried. It was fragmented, his head, dipped in tar, mounted on a spike, stared down from London Bridge, not to honor him, to own him. Travelers from across the kingdom passed beneath that blackened skull. They did not see a rebel. They saw a message. You are not untouchable. You are not safe. You are not remembered. But even that was not enough. The rest of Wallace's body was hacked apart with the same brutal intent. Not sloppily, not in haste. The quartering was methodical. Limbs, torso, each piece treated like a scroll meant to be read by cities. One quarter was sent to Newcastle, border city, pressure point, gateway to Scotland. Another to Berwick-upon-Tweed, a place caught in centuries of tug-of-war. A third to Stirling, where Wallace had once made fools of Edward's armies. The final to Perth, where resistance still lingered. They weren't sent to rot. They were installed. Each city received its package like a royal decree. The flesh was nailed, hung, exposed in the most visible square. People walked under them, looked up, and learned. Children would ask, "Who was that?" And the answer, always in a whisper, "That was what happens." These pieces didn't decay in darkness. They decomposed in sunlight. The stench was intentional. The flies, the dripping, the slow transformation from flesh to bone, it all served the same purpose: repetition. Every glance upward reminded the living what power looked like. This was not medieval barbarism, it was imperial design. The body as media, the corpse as law. The state didn't need to explain itself when the evidence swung from wood and iron in every major city. But the flaw was this: flesh rots, fear fades, and stories evolve because something unexpected happened. Wallace's body was scattered, but the story reassembled. Not in castles or courts, but in taverns, in songs, in hidden gatherings where farmers and soldiers whispered about a man who never bowed. The English crown had meant to write an ending. Instead, they lit a fuse. They had quartered a man, but they'd multiplied a myth. Every city that nailed him to its gates unknowingly gave him new voice, new reach. His memory traveled faster than his remains. The further his body was dispersed, the wider the legend spread. Because even as Edward the First tried to speak through blood, the people learned to read between the limbs. And they didn't see warning. They saw prophecy. Wallace, who had once walked through mud and ash to defend a country fractured by fear, now lived in fragments. But each fragment pointed in one direction: resistance. Years later, when Scotland did rise again, his name was whispered like armor, not as a call for revenge, but as proof that even death, even public ruin, even dismemberment couldn't stop a true defiance from echoing. The English crown had tried to erase a man. Instead, they created a symbol that no execution could silence. And that, perhaps, is the truest failure of tyranny. It forgets that blood writes deeper than law, and legends once born do not need flesh to live.